What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another modern video. And it just seems like it's Creativity Week on my channel. I went over the four-color creativity deck for modern. I went over the Is It creativity deck that Reduke took to a first-place finish at the Pro Tour All Be One just a few weeks ago, and today we're going to be doing the guide to four-color creativity in Modern, the deck that I played in the Mana Trader series this past weekend. A deck that I've grown a lot to like, and a lot of things that I've learned in all the matches that I played leading up to the event, and even some of the matches in the event. Of course, in this type of video, we're going to do a guide style, so I'm going to be going card by card, exactly kind of the reason why you're playing these cards, why they're good, and how they fit and service their role in the deck. So, of course, before we get into it, I would like to implore you, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, that you do so and ring the notification bell as well so you know when I post videos. I try to do deck techs over different decks in Modern and Pioneer, which is mainly the content that we do, on top of doing guides like this and other sort of like essay type videos. So if any of that is interest to you, please consider subscribing and of course ring the notification bell so you know when those videos are posted. If you go into the description of this video, there is two links that you can follow. One goes to my Twitch channel, so if you want to see live content from me, go ahead and follow me over on Twitch so you get notified when I go live. There's also a link in the description to the Discord server that I run. If that is something that interests you and you want to go talk about Magic, stuff like that, anything I discuss in my videos, going over deck tips, stuff like that, uh, go ahead and join that Discord server and go ahead and shoot me a message. So, with all that out of the way, four-color creativity. Hopefully the end-all be-all starter guide for anybody interested in playing the deck, learning the deck, and everything in between. So, the main mission essentially of like the main game plan for this four-color creativity deck is to get this card Archon of Cruelty into play. Archon of Cruelty enters the battlefield or it attacks. A targeted opponent sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card and loses 3 life. You draw a card and gain 3 life. There's a card called Cruel Ultimatum, and this card is kind of the mini version of that card. Where you get a ton of value just from it entering the battlefield. It obviously can get rid of one of your opponent's probably like worst creatures, but a lot of other decks, like the four-color creativity deck, is the only one that makes like a kind of like a surplus of like creature tokens. So normally you're going to be hitting a creature worth its weight in salt on the battlefield, or just getting rid of like a planeswalker and things like that. And of course, getting to replace the Archon itself by getting to draw a card. Getting 3 life too in like a lot of aggressive matchups can be very good, and of course, those aggressive decks having to deal with a 6/6 can be pretty tough. So obviously, the point of this deck is not to hardcast Archon of Cruelty. 8 mana is a lot of mana for the modern format, even with like short of like Amulet Titan, like 8 mana is a lot. So there is two main ways that this deck is trying to put an Archon of Cruelty into play. The one is the namesake card, Indomitable Creativity. You can pay X and triple red. You destroy X target artifacts under creatures, and for each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and they exile that card. Those players put the exile cards onto the battlefield and shuffle their library. So creativity is super explosive. Obviously, on turn 4, you can make a token with the help of the card Dwarven Mine and having 3 other mountains in play to make a 1/1 and then tap all of your lands to play Indomitable Creativity, X equaling 1. You get 1 Archon. You do it for 2, you get 2 Archons, and normally if you're into putting like 3 into play, the game is virtually over. Like, it's very, very hard for your opponent to come back. They have to play some very weird cards that have not seen play in Modern in a very long time to actually beat a double or even triple like Archon, creativity. Uh, some things to know when playing the card Indomitable Creativity. uh, the card needs to destroy the artifacts and or creatures. So this deck makes uh, treasure tokens and stuff, so like you can like target your own treasure tokens. And then you end up coming into the problem of if you have to use the mana from the treasure tokens when the creativity is still in the stack and targeting your treasure token that you are trying to turn into an Archon. If you try to use the mana to like say like cast a spell pierce to counter a counter spell, you will not get an Archon for that treasure token because it is not there when the spell resolves, and there's nothing there to destroy, so you don't get to flip anything. So important to know, your opponent can disrupt it by also using a removal spell on your creature as well that you target with Indomitable Creativity. So definitely something to keep in mind when playing this card. So it can be smart to, in some cases, and a lot of the time, for playing combo decks, it is good to kind of like wait and hold on, like not go for it as soon as possible, but find like a good window to resolve your big fancy spell. And waiting to cast like a creativity like X3, it can be pretty good because even if your opponent has like one or two removal spells, you still get an Archon to play, and they've spent two cards out of their hand, and then Archon is going to get another one out of their hand. So even if they end up having a removal spell past all of that for the Archon, you have gotten four cards out of their hand essentially. You've gotten a card back, so you've replaced like the creativity that you just cast, and you have three cards in your deck that are able to get that Archon back that just got sent to the graveyard, from your opponent using its removal spell, and that's the card Persist. Persist returns target non-legendary creature from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. Uh, the card Persist is kind of like a callback to the Lorwyn mechanic Persist, which when the creature died, if it didn't have a -1/-1 counter on it, it came back with a -1/-1 counter. Not really relevant to the deck, but I just thought it was a nice like little trivia, a little fact that you can kind of chew on. So persist, targeting Arcana Cruelty essentially accomplishes the same thing. Uh, the difference between like a 6/6 and a 5/5, and like obviously some of the bigger threats like Titan stuff is still gonna just find a way to run over an Archon. Like you're probably not winning that battle, so like it really doesn't matter. The Archon comes back with a -1/-1 counter. It's still gonna be bigger than like a lot of the threats and stuff like that. So that's something. But this is a way even earlier than casting a turn 4 creativity, putting an Archon into play with the help of some of these other cards that we're going to be getting into. While not obviously as explosive as like casting a creativity X2 or X3 and putting a bunch of them into play, it's still very effective for the fact that like once you get an Archon into play and your opponent is able to deal with it, whether it's with Unholy Heat or trading with it in combat, so on. You have three cards specifically in this version to get back an Archon on top of having other copies of Creativity to go and get the Archons that are remaining in your deck. So now that we've kind of explained, the role of, the main pieces of the combo, how are we facilitating it? And with the four-color version, there's like two separate categories past the meat and potatoes of the deck. You have your 12 spells, which I have conveniently placed on the left-hand side of, this screen that you're looking at, that are going to be like your interaction. So you have four spell pierces, you have four leyline bindings, and you have four lightning bolts. Spell Pierce is able to give you some relevant interaction in like the early game, and if your opponent decides to like try to like tap low for say like a Ledger Shredder, and something like the Murktide matchups and things like that, you are able to fight off like potential counter spells. If your opponent has to tap out for counter spell Pierce back up. You end up just countering the counter spell, and you get to put a bunch of Archons into play, and the game is probably over. Also, in the early games, when you're playing against like other mid-range decks or like other decks that are trying to be disruptive, Spell Pierce can, just come out of nowhere, stop like the hand disruption spell that is going to kind of ruin your setup. Take your creativity, take your persist, maybe take your discard outlet for your Archon, and so on. So Spell Pierce in the format, particularly right now, is very good with some of the most popular decks that people are wanting to play. And just Spell Pierce has always been kind of good, and only really gets better as some of like the other non-creature heavy like spell decks continue to exist. So definitely looking to see Spell Pierce do a lot of work in a lot of your games when playing the four-color deck. Moving on, I'm going to skip past Leyline Binding because we have Lightning Bolt. Good old trusty Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to any target. is, very good and very well positioned against a lot of the 1 and 2 mana threats in the format. Ledger Shredder being like 1/3, your opponent decides to like leave up like Bauble or something like that. They're gonna cast a Bauble to try to trigger the Connive ability. You can just sneak a Lightning Bolt in there and get rid of the Ledger Shredder before it gets a chance to accrue any more value. You have the Ragavans, you have Dragon Rage Channelers, you have just about any threat from the Hammer deck, essentially anything that is not like a construct, which then those two are the most played decks. So like Lightning Bolt definitely does a lot of work. Of course, it can go to the face when you pair it with Red and 6 Emblem, which we'll explain this here in a second. But pair like Lightning Bolt with the Red and 6 Emblem, and you could just win the game that way without even having to necessarily cast Archon of Cruelty or put it into play. So Lightning Bolt just kind of gets to do a lot for its 1 mana cost, and is essentially old reliable to like a lot of people. So definitely a good card to have around, and a very, very good removal option since this deck isn't going to really be able to get Delirium. So Unholy Heat really isn't that good of an option. You might as well just have a guaranteed 3 damage rather than, possibly maybe building your deck in a way to where you could get up to Delirium to deal 6 damage. And partly a reason why this deck isn't going to need something like Unholy Heat is because of the card Leyline Binding. Even though this is a considered 4-color creativity, it really has 5 colors in it. It has all the basic land types in it, with Zayatora's Proving Ground being the Jund color Triome, and then you have, Rogran Triome, the Jeskai Triome, Ketria Triome, Temur Triome, and on top of just having like the different shock lands, like you have Steam Vents, you have Stomping Grounds, you have a Blood Crypt, and then you have a where is it? You also have the Sacred Foundry. It's hiding right there. So you have a way to, essentially get full domain, make Leyline Binding a 1 mana spell that is going to be a catch-all to like everything else that like Lightning Bolt is not going to be able to deal with, and things that Spell Pierce aren't going to be able to disrupt. Mainly like annoying Planeswalkers that you might not be able to deal with using like Lightning Bolt and didn't have a chance to Spell Pierce. You have like bigger creatures, like you have the Scion of Dracos with the Domain Zoo decks kind of roaming around. Like that's a way that you can deal with Dracos. Way you can deal with like Tarmogoyfs and things like that. Also getting to deal with like opposing Archons. While not necessarily like the best way of doing it, even though like the deck really doesn't have a way to get rid of like opposing enchantments. Uh, just because the Archon's gonna get to come into play and so on, get a card from you, and then like Leyline Binding is another card, so it's like you're down 2 and they break even. But I digress. Like Leyline Binding is just a very good catch-all to kind of just eliminate what the other 2 cards aren't going to be able to take care of. So that's your 1 mana interaction, and one of the ways of one of the benefits of like playing this version of the deck is that these cards get to be reactive to what your opponent does. You can on turn 1 fetch up a red, a red shock land. You can go get Steam Vents if you need to Spell Pierce. You can go get Sacred Foundry to set up like a Leyline Binding, and then of course be able to leave up Lightning Bolt. Obviously, the key being that you need the mountains to make Dwarven Mine come untapped. And if you don't need to do anything, you can just fetch up one of these triomes, mainly the Jeskai Triome, the majority of the time, to ensure that you can cast all these spells, because then your next fetch land can fetch up a Zayatora's Proving Ground, which will give you full domain, make Leyline Bindings 1 mana, and then of course, like you still are leaving up Spell Pierce and Lightning Bolt. From there, we have the rest of the cards in the deck that are going to enable like the Indomitable Creativity game plan very well, and even like feed into like the persist side of it. So since we kind of have 2 halves of like a combo here, I mean, we obviously have like Indomitable Creativity, the namesake of the deck. We have persist. The 2 cards here, the 7 cards here, the Fable of the Mirror Breakers and Prismari commands can feed into both halves of the game plan. So what I mean by that is Fable and Mirrorbreaker makes a 2/2 that whenever it attacks creates a treasure token. So it's creating more creature, more artifacts, and creates a creature token that Indomitable Creativity can hit, and obviously we can attack on turn 4 with said token. We're able to fetch up a Dwarven Mine, and then using the treasure mana, able to put 2 Archons into play. again, barring any removal, so on and so forth. But ideally, getting to do that, trading the Goblin and the Dwarf token for 2 Archons is pretty sweet. On top of that, the second chapter allows you to discard up to 2 cards and then draw that many cards. So it allows you to kind of like ditch some of these like redundant lands. Maybe one of these 3 spells just aren't cutting it in like the matchup, so you're able to ditch it and hopefully draw into like a creativity or persist. It also, if you draw an Archon of Cruelty, you're able to just get rid of it into the graveyard and start looking for persist to get back Archon of Cruelties from your graveyard. Prismari Command getting to fall in the same category as Fable the Mirrorbreaker, just not as good. Just for the fact that like with Fable, if the token goes unchecked, you can make multiple treasure tokens, which eventually means that you could hard cast an Archon of Cruelty, which does come up more often than not, but you definitely don't want to be in that position where you're hard casting an Archon of Cruelty. But Prismari Command, some of the most relevant modes being like target player draws 2 cards, discard 2 cards, creates a treasure token. Obviously, both one feeds into like more of the persist half of like the combo that we're trying to assemble, and the treasure token feeding into like the indomitable creativity side of it. On top of that, like if you only need to create a treasure token because you're holding a creativity or you have an Archon in hand, and you want to try find a persist, you can end up choosing one of the other modes. Destroy target artifact, really good against like the hammer decks, getting to deal 2 damage to any target. We talk about like lightning bolt, getting to tag some of the creatures. While Prismari Command, that mode is not going to be as good as like necessarily like lightning bolt. Like the difference between 2 and 3 damage, really does matter a lot when you start getting into ledger shredders that have counters on them, and you have like Dragon Rage channelers or Delirious. Still relevant to just hit some of the early threats that stick around. This can deal with like a Ragavan, and if you just let that card like snowball, your opponent's just gonna have so much mana and have such a high mana advantage. That's gonna be very hard for you to come back. So Prismari Command can help you deal with cards like that. Even on like turn 3, but mainly a lot of the time you're gonna end up like looting, draw 2, discard 2, and then making a treasure token because you're kind of attacking from both axes of like threatening a creativity, that is much larger than just putting one Archon into play, and of course like casting a persist, which is able to leave up mana so that you can uh, protect it either with like spell pierces and things like that. So these 7 cards being pretty integral to the game plan for the fact that like you want one of these cards on turn 3 because they're going to push your combo and push what you're trying to do a lot farther than like the other 6 cards here, which are the 4 red and 6 and the 2 bitter reunion. Red and 6, while it doesn't like on its surface doesn't look like it helps the combo at all. It's just like a kind of like a value piece, right? Um, in reality, the fact that red and 6 gets lands from your graveyard and puts it into your hand lets you pick up fetch lands, which essentially means that you always can have access to a Dwarven Mine. Which, when you're late in the game and you're kind of top decking and you like hit a creativity, and you have this red and 6 out, just being to pick up a fetch land, fetch up a Dwarven Mine, and then immediately creativity it. In these top deck wars, your opponent has to find an answer for cruelty like Archon of Cruelty like right then and there. And if they don't, like they more than likely lose the game because if they can't play the card in their hand, it's just gonna get discarded to Archon, and it just ends up being a mess. And then like your opponent is just kind of like up a creek without a paddle, honestly. Bitter Reunion lets you discard a card, and if you do, draw 2 cards. Obviously, this doesn't have to ditch an Archon of Cruelty right away. Granted, this is a way that you can get like a turn 3 Archon by playing this on turn 2, ditching the Archon, drawing 2 cards, and then you're able to persist back the Archon, and then also pay 1, sacrifice the Bitter Reunion to give it haste, and you're able to get 2 cards out of your opponent's hand, drain them for 6. You're able to draw 2 cards, gain 6 life, and get rid of like two creatures or planeswalkers or what have you, some combination of those from your opponent's battlefield, and that's something that's really hard to recover from when your opponent has to get rid of like 4 cards for your 2 cards, and you already got value out of one of them. So that's a breakdown, the 6-card breakdown of the creativity deck. The sideboard, I do not want to put that there. The sideboard, and I've played different versions of the deck that have different sideboard cards, but I'll go over these ones. Uh, the Emrakul in the sideboard, obviously you could bring this in against like mill, and they're just gonna have to find a way to like instant speed, get rid of the Emrakul, and then have to mill all of your cards again. There is a world to where you kind of ditch this persist package, and like you take out like all these cards, and then you just bring in like an Emrakul because it's going to get around everything minus Leyline Binding, and you bring in some of these other like kind of protection spells, we'll call them. You bring in like Fluster Storms to try to protect your creativities, Veil of Summers to kind of fight through counter spells, and also protect your creatures from a decent amount of removal format. Obviously, like Unholy Lightning Bolt, you're not going to be getting around that, but people playing like Fatal Push and stuff like that are going to get got by Veil of Summer. Playing Terminate is on the uptick, and Dreadbore and stuff like that. You have these Leyline of Sanctities where you bring them in against like the mirror match, like Archon does target an opponent. So if you have a Leyline of Sanctity in play, your opponent, whether the Archon enters the battlefield or attacks, it's not going to be able to target you. Um, Not like the most ideal because you still are having to deal with a 6/6 flyer, but you know a 6/6 flyer that doesn't do anything is a lot easier to deal with than a 6/6 flyer that keeps making you discard cards whenever it attacks, losing life, and getting your opponent card advantage. Some other cards that you could play like in the sideboards that kind of mess around with it. You could play like Leyline of the Void. You can attack more like the graveyard decks if you know you're more interested in beating like Dredge and beating Living End. Uh, Hollowed Moonlights, I think, are a card that like you have to play for the fact that it does stop quite a few of the decks. It still goes after some of the graveyard decks that we just talked about in Living End and Dredge, but also kind of getting like the Rhino decks because you know they can't put their 4/4s into play because they weren't cast. You can do this against like opposing creativity decks just by stopping them from getting to put their things into play. You know, and the list kind of just goes on. Anyone that's trying to do like unfair things and get monsters into play, kind of like how we are on Hollowed Moonlight, is going to help out tremendously. I've seen some lists playing like Sarah's Emissary. I played Sarah's Emissary in the Mana Traders event, and then it ended up didn't like not being all that great. However, like when I was playing in the Swiss for the, you know, to qualify for the event, I had two Sarah's Emissaries in the sideboard from the other list that I had, and I thought they were great. You know, there's like some decks where this just I put this into play and they couldn't deal with it. You know, it just sat on the battlefield and eventually they ended up losing the game because, you know, I had protection from creatures and things like that. So, definitely some things that you could like tweak in the sideboard. Uh, Definitely a deck that I would have played that I would play again in an event like that, but probably just like tweak the sideboard just because I didn't like a lot of the options that I ended up having, you know. And again, like hindsight's 2020, but you know, it is what it is. And so that, my friends, is the four color creativity deck for modern. This is like the in-depth guide, you know, for beginners, people trying to learn the deck, so on. It's definitely like a really fun deck. It's very powerful. And while it seems like it's kind of flashy to do the creativity thing, you know, on turn 4 and just get one Archon to play, if you can demonstrate some patience in certain matchups, and really a lot of them, as I've learned, you're able to kind of like punish your opponent more for trying to have removal and trying to remove your creature token, you know, your dwarves from Dwarven Mine or your goblin shamans. Even like the flip side of Reflection of Kiki Jiki, you know, if they only have like one removal spell, it's like, okay, cool, like I'll destroy two of my other things and put two Archons into play, and you're going to lose the game in very short order. So definitely things to consider. A few other things that, of course, I'm remembering now instead of like remembering while we were actually going over the cards. The fact that Archon is not a legendary creature means that Fable the Mirrorbreaker can make a copy of it and give it haste, which means that you're going to get an ETB trigger from the Archon that you just created and an attack trigger as well from the same Archon. Also, not anything to do necessarily with what's going on here, but if you manage to get two Fable of the Mirror Breakers flipped into Reflection of Kiki Jiki, you are able to copy them and make an amount of them equal to the amount of mana that you have. While again, it's not really necessarily relevant to this here. If you have like 7, 8 mana in play, you're just getting to make 8/2/2s on your opponent's turn and getting to untap and attack with them. Or, again, even make even more 2/2s, you end up having like 16 2/2s. Pretty hard for a lot of decks to beat. So something that can come up. It never happened to me, but it's just a little tip, if you will. Like really, I can go with any Fable the Mirror deck. So yeah, that is the 4-color creativity deck. We'll be moving on to some other stuff next week. Again, I didn't really plan on like there being this much creativity content on the channel for this week. It just sort of kind of happened that way. And yeah, the deck's a lot of fun. It's really sweet. I wish that I had played more games with it to kind of learn some of the things I learned, like just casting bigger creativities, like not necessarily worrying about leaving up like Spell Pierce and things like that against the decks that like have removal. Just put as many objects into play and then target as many of them as possible and make your opponent have like answers for them. Because in reality, casting a creativity X1 or X2 and leaving up a Spell Pierce probably isn't as good as just like an X4 creativity and getting 2 cards out of your opponent's hand, because then you're going to get 2 more cards from the other 2 Archons and stuff. So that's going to do it for me in this video. I hope you all enjoyed. Again, if you have not already subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so and ring a notification bell so you know when I post, my videos get posted, and following the links in the description to join the Discord server, and also follow me on Twitch as well so you see some of my live content. I'm going to be trying to go live more often on like the weekends and stuff, or during like the Mana Traders events and whatnot, to get some Magic content out there. So that's going to be pretty sweet. But yeah, that's going to do it for me this video. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you found this guide helpful, and I will see you all in the next video.